Ringraziamo Professor Fallico per questo suo
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Pallico, for your very active considerations that opens up the door to the first topics of our forum. We are going to talk about a very important issue, the economy of trust and energy security of Greater Eurasia. We know that a key element in the geopolitical questions involving all the world, basically, is oil and energy resources. So we have to ask ourselves how this key market is changing and what can be the main consequences of these changes. I'm therefore very pleased to give the floor back to President Sechin for his opening presentation.
Уважаемые участники и гости форума.
Dear participants, let me welcome you to this 11th edition of the Eurasian Economic Forum. We have here today with us politicians and businessmen that play a key role in the economy of their country and in the development of regions and the whole world. This is evidence of the importance of the topics we discuss here and the importance of this forum to discuss important issues concerning energy security in Eurasia. I wish to thank the organizers indeed for choosing this topic, which they call the economy of trust. In spite of that, I think there's a major difference between the creative work made in building up this economy of trust and what really happens in the world economy. In a few months, it will be the 5th anniversary from the moment when the illegal sanctions against the Russian Federation were implemented. In 10 days, sanctions will be applied against Iran, even though, judging from the dynamics of the oil market, it seems that there will be some derogations for American businesses. Energy is really in a key historic moment. That's why I'm very pleased to colleagues for their availability and their readiness to discuss these thorny issues during our forum. Today, I don't want to go into assessments or forecasts. In the past year, there has been some quality changes. Price conditions have improved, and yet, as I said several times, the task of building up sustainable development is still far from being solved. But let me start from the sanctions. This phenomenon of sanction is still to be investigated and explored, but sanctions are now so frequent and varied that they have taken up a different characteristic. We feel that this is not this is an attempt really to change completely the market situation in favor of those who promote these sanctions to weaken their competitors. The choice of the sectors to affect speaks for itself. Energy, metals, cooperation in the technical and military field, banking sector. These are the main sectors where Russia and the USA are in competition. The reasons why sanctions were applied indicates that the ultimate aim was to force countries to change their internal and foreign policy rather than really calling into question responsibility for the business sector. The American attitude, and I'm referring to decree number 13660, that restrictions aim is not to punish anyone, but they are a way of putting pressure and increasing the price that Russia has to pay as long as it stands in its own policy. The European Court has made a decision against the sanctions in the case of Rosneft, the Rosneft case, and this showed that it's a highly political issue, the purpose of which was to exert influence on the oil sector, which is so important for the Russian Federation's budget. The sanctions must concern concrete events or violations, and none of this is present in this case. The restrictions to our company are growing. I would say that this is not a real form of sanctions, but a completely it's an attitude that is lacking facts at its base. You remember this book, Treasury Wars, it's the beginning of the new era of financial struggle. Treasury Wars, the beginning of a new era for financial struggle. Being high official of the U.S. administration, the author was a testimony of the policy aimed at reducing or cutting down the financial position of the U.S. opponents. So terrorism has been used, if you like, as a way of opposing competitors. This restriction did not concern companies that control 1/3 of oil production. Some persons in the market and even countries became hostages of this situation. So there's no room for an equitable dialogue. We have to get ready to the political impact of these unilateral sanctions that will lead to a loss of a large market share by many of the businesses involved. This conclusion seems quite obvious to me. The United States have lost just 0.16% of the losses brought about by these sanctions, whereas Germany was affected in terms of 40% of the same loss. So the question that arises quite obviously is that this probably was an attempt to protect U.S. producers. In the past, we talked about Total leaving the Iranian project, and now many European companies have stopped cooperating with Iranian partners. That will probably lead to a complete ban of imports of oil from Iran starting on November the 5th. This rhetoric is an obstacle to capital movement, increases investment cost, and this probably has become one of the reasons for the Saudi Aramco decision to leave IPO. The present supply of liquids is about 100 million barrels a day. However, we couldn't view this as a sign of a long-term effect. We have no ways to guarantee the stability. these treasury wars waged by the U.S. are going to bring about major imbalances in the oil market. If we add to this the reduction of obstructions in Venezuela, instability in Libya, the drop in the supply of oil in the fourth quarter could be 2 million barrels a day. Recent news talk about the large amount of exports from Iran to China, and in accordance with our sources, it should be a large group of ships carrying about 20 million barrels in October, November this year, even though the usual amount is 1.3. This 0.3 million barrels, this brings about a major imbalance in the market. Apparently, the U.S. have their own perception of the role that they have the right to play in this process, and they act as regulators of the world market. OPEC, on its side, had to reduce its market share to the benefit of the U.S. shale oil. So the OPEC Plus production dropped by 2 million barrels, whereas in the United States, it went up by 2.2 million barrels a day. And indeed, in the United States really want to become major oil exporters. So we would have something like a U.S. PEC, if you like. And indeed, in the light of recent events, the relationships between Russia and USA and Saudi Arabia is really very strong. In last May, contract was signed for over $300 billion. So this is quite probably going to be the same trend in the future. It's not surprising that experts are starting to say that sanctions will not impact would have no impact of new production, even though the withdrawal of Total from Iran and the sanctions against Venezuela, Chile, China, and Libya are an obstacle to these new projects. I do not agree with Goldman Sachs analysts who claim that the rhetoric of sanctions does not imply an increase in oil prices, because shale oil producers and OPEC will have a chance to launch new production. So I think that that's a mistake, a misperception. The recent data of the U.S. Department of Energy agencies claim that free production potential in OPEC countries does not exceed 1.4 million barrels a day, and 1.3 million come from one country, Saudi Arabia. The potential to use still available is the lowest in the past 10 years. Oil prices increased significantly, mostly because there was fear for this possible evolution, and any negative development might trigger off another significant sudden growth in oil price that will block the economic growth process of the past 10 years. That will be a damage for all, including China and India, but especially the poorest countries. At the end, those who are going to pay are going to be also European and US consumers. Historically, global cooperation until recently has resulted in a win-win strategy. So both partners, both participants in the world economic system were actually having an advantage. Over the past 30 years, free trade increased by 65%. And this was an important stimulus to global growth. However, the U.S. has taken up a new strategy now, a win-lose strategy, where protectionism has some temporary effects that are beneficial only for one of the sides. The debt for extraction companies have been reduced thanks partly to this increase in prices. But there's a conflict of interest when the US for decades have mistaken their role of regulator as with the role of protecting their own interest. But we know from history that this attitude has also another impact. In the early 19th century, the time of nationalism, there was a monopolization of the economy, which was detrimental for final consumers, but also for those countries that had lost a great engine to increase technological process and innovation. At the moment, the increase in cost for consumers worldwide could be as much as 10-15%. And trade wars are going to have a cost for the world that will be from 0.5 to 0.8 of the world GDP, so something like $400 to $700 billion a year. This also has a boomerang effect. As a reaction to the US tariff, China imposed import taxes on many things, including liquefied gas. This implies gasification devices for 60 million barrels a year, but this will imply also a greater expense for US producers. So the damage of these measures to the American company will probably block this period of high growth of US economy. In spite of their limited dependency on foreign trade, the US require other countries' readiness to finance the deficit of the US budget. 1/4 of it is now in the hands, if you like, of countries that have already suffered restrictions and sanctions by the US itself. If we also take into account the European Union, of course, the US administration has expectation from them. This share is as high as 50%. I'm sure that a win-win relationship will continue to develop successfully. Conversely, the lack of will to respect international regulations, withdrawal from agreements, are all things that reduce the trust in the United States. And the loss of trust to the US is yet another example that 95% of the world is looking for an alternative to the present model. I think we have to work on a system based on trust and respect to establish common dialogue. In terms of oil prices, this level reflects a balance between demand and supply. When is demand going to start dropping? It seems that by 2030, 2040, demand will stop growing. But we have to make a distinction between long and short-term prospects. Experts believe that in 2040, oil consumption will be greater than it was in 2016 and 2017, and demand will increase in developing countries as their economic condition improves. I don't think we should be too optimistic for the future of electric cars. Infrastructures and costs related to this system are still largely based on state aids. To generate electricity, in addition, coal could be changed, and that would not have any significant advantage for the environment. Recently, it came out that stockholders of IMAS will want to lose their income, even though they have been sort of betrayed. We can't say that there's a major progress in the area of fuel cells. The International Energy Agency predicts that the share of renewables by 2040 won't exceed 20%. So there will be a growth of 6% from 2016 to 2040. So organic and fossil fuels will still be responsible for 75% of energy requirements. We have to have guarantees for access to liquid fuels in the medium and long term. So we have to create new production potentials to replace those that shut down. This implies the need for stable investment inflows. This is also supported by the Secretary General of OPEC, who said that insufficient investments are indeed one of the major problems for the oil sector. The drop in investment brought about by the drop in oil prices will have a major impact. The dynamics of majors imply drop of the investment from 345 to 100 to $75 billion. Long-term projects do not guarantee a rapid recovery of these investments as long as prices are low, so they cannot guarantee sustainability of future oil extraction. In the light of this, I think it would be rather unwise to trust too much shale oil-related projects, because shale oil is a technology that still have a number of problems, difficulties to overcome, and this may not compensate the drop of normal oil extraction by 5 to 7%. And in fact, in the US, there are already those that claim that future prospects for shale oil are rather poor.
According to expert estimates, according to these estimates, the company will have to relinquish financial efficiency and increase investments, and at least 5 years will be needed so that a favorable level is achieved. Even though in 2018 investments were raised, and I'm talking about exploration and production investments, these are not enough to ensure sustainable long-term development. And Rosneft in 2014 to 2017 continued to invest in exploration and production. Our company, has increased investment by 50% from $9.2 billion in 2014 to $13 billion in 2017, 13.7 actually. And in 18 months' time, we will be launching more than 7 new global-scale projects. And in this framework, I would like to call your attention to environment and climate change. This is a very serious issue. Of course, we have to reduce emissions. And of course, we should not increase the amount of renewable sources at any cost, because funding renewables only could lead to a lack of investment in exploration and production, and investment devoted to research and development, and this would be counterproductive. I can state that we are very, very willing to become global leaders as regards environment protection in our business, in our industry, of course. And thanks to what Rosneft is doing, we can say that our greenhouse gas emissions, this level is very low. It has decreased by 8% in 3 years. According to Bloomberg, this amount is much lower compared with other companies like Total and others. And our goal is to achieve by 2022 to be in the first quartile of all global companies in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So this is our goal. Of course, reducing greenhouse gas emissions is not easy also because every year we open up new oil fields, of course, and this is why we may have problems. But certainly, because of stiffening of environment protection standards has led to a stagnation of investments. Of course, we do believe in a sustainable development for humankind, but we should be over simplistic. Let me talk about my vision of the development of the oil sector in Russia. Russia and Rosneft actually have a remarkable resource base that they can be working on. Specific costs and investment, and the cost of our projects are among the lowest in the world, and as low as in Saudi Arabia, and even lower. And some analysts have classified the Russian projects worse, considered them worse than what they actually are. Actually, this is wrong. I think that these American analysts are having a biased view of Russian investments and new projects. In terms of operating expenses and direct investment, our basis is very good. And unfortunately, this factor is not very well understood. And some colleagues even said that in 10 to 15 years, Russia will be forced to go out of the global oil market. Of course, this is totally false. In our opinion, there will be 3 leaders in a few years: Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the US, even though they have different structures, different organizational principles, and our investments in global growth and, of course, our partners very much like the atmosphere of trust that we want to promote. We want to work on an equal footing, on a level playing field with all our partners. The reserves and the stock of hydrocarbons has trebled since 2014, and the projects we have with our partners aim at ensuring the well-being of all countries. Despite the volatility also caused by sanctions, Rosneft is still the engine, the driver of development in the Eurasian relations. It is the very hub, the very hinge of this economy of trust, which we are discussing today. And this, in our opinion, is the right approach for us and for our partners. During the last year, we've had new shareholders like the Qatar Sovereign Fund with an 18.93 share. BP and Glencore have approximately 40% of our shares, but the number one shareholder is still the state. We have now adopted a new strategy, Rosneft 2022, aiming at improving profitability and the efficiency of the assets already available to us. And Rosneft also, I think, has given ample demonstration of being successful abroad. For example, the project we have carried out together with Eni and BP, this is a very successful project, and we have already started to produce gas for commercial purposes. And I think there are also good prospects in our projects with ExxonMobil in the Mozambique platform. We want to behave responsibly. We want to improve cooperation, the economy of trust and diplomacy of business. This is the guarantee of success. This is the choice this Rosneft and this partner has made. In the last few years, we have expanded the number of projects based on partnerships, on collaborations. We have opened up new collaborations for offshore and onshore exploration and production in other businesses as well. In the Eurasian area, where there is still a cooperation strategy, Rosneft has opened up partnerships with the most important companies in the Eurasian area. We encourage this type of cooperation, and our main shareholder, one of our shareholders and partners, BP, has become a part and parcel of the capital of some of the money invested in some projects, and they plan to go to continue on this line. And the Norwegian company is collaborating with us in the exploration in the Samara region, for example. And then we have two offshore projects in Western Africa, in Norway also, and our Chinese partners collaborating with us in Udmurtia, where we are carrying out a very interesting venture. And the Chinese company is also continuing the project of the Verkhney-Chonsky field, and together with Sinopec, we are preparing the beginning of the work in the Severodvinski-Sakhalin 3 project. The Indian ONGC has been working with us in the framework of Sakhalin 1, and we are considering the opportunity of expanding cooperation with the Vietnamese partner, Petro Vietnam. And other opportunities exist in the downstream sector. Rosneft is ranking third in terms of processing, oil processing. In Germany, for example, 12.5 million tons per year, more than 12%, excuse me, of all the oil which is processed in Germany. And then we have also the pipelines, Druzhbanichiv, which has been working in Europe for more than 50 years and working successful. Another example of collaboration is that between Russia and India. Rosneft has just purchased a refinery in India, a highly technological plant, and this has allowed us to have a synergistic impact on the Indian market. This means that we can develop mutually beneficial relationships. And from this point of view, the St. Petersburg Forum is an interesting opportunity. I would like to invite you all to take part in our next forum in June next year in St. Petersburg. in the future, too, we are willing to further develop partnerships in all the fields of our activity. We will be looking for new synergies in order to be beneficial both for customers and for producers and manufacturers. Thank you very much for your attention.
We
would like to thank President Secin for this very exhaustive and very interesting analysis that gives us a lot of food for thought, something that we can build on for the rest of our meeting. And of course, we have been talking about investments, insufficient investment, prices, and this is all very important. And because of this, I would like to ask Robert Dudley from BP to talk about these things, really, because paradoxically, for years, we have read analyses about a drop in demand for oil and gas, but actually the latest estimates indicate that the demand will be growing from now to 2040. This might be a challenge for the market. Who can really meet this demand that goes up? Who can help us, and what the price will be?
Well, thank you very much. And Igor Ivanovich, thank you very much for that speech and a good setup for this. For there to be sufficient oil supplies to be able to meet demand, in any future scenario, the world will need significant more investment in oil and gas. So just take oil today. The world produces and uses about 100 million barrels per day. And if you stopped investing in oil, and it naturally declined at 3% a year, by 2040, production would only be 45 million barrels a day, so more than half reduced. So even in any scenario consistent with anybody's projections, continuous investment is needed. Now, to give you a sense of the scale needed in energy, by 2040, energy demand will be about 1/3 more than it is today. That is the equivalent, if you can imagine, of a whole new Europe and a whole new China coming onto the world demand stage. And that's in a world with 2 billion more people. Today, 1 billion people do not have access to electricity, and 2 billion people cook with wood and biomass and cow dung. So the world will need all forms of energy, and at the same time, it will need much lower emissions. So that's the dual challenge that we have in the world of both producing more and more affordable energy and reduced emissions. So in the upstream, the point about lack of investment. Investment in the oil and gas industry has dropped by 40% from 2014 to 2017. 2017, it only increased by around 2 to 3%, and in 2018, it's only going to increase by about 5%. So while there's cost inflation, the industry needs to continue investing, and I think faster, to avoid a supply shortfall in the next 5 years. We already see the spending and activities increasing somewhat in oil and gas, and Rosneft is a good example. But generally, it's not a great rise in terms of the spending. So on the demand side, concerns about trade conflicts, especially between the U.S. and China, could slow global trade and GDP growth, could adversely affect demand. Now, the supply concerns are mainly Iran, Venezuela, Libya, the U.S., and OPEC. And Iran, at this moment, it remains very unclear how the U.S. sanctions will impact Iranian crude production and condensate from just the beginning of next month. But the preliminary data from September shows that exports of around 1.8 million barrels per day will be close to 1 million barrels per day lower very shortly. So going forward, there is uncertainty about this, about how much the exports will decline. It is a little uncertain to me about whether the U.S. administration will grant some waivers and the position that the main buyers of Iranian crude will take. That's why we're seeing a lot of the volatility in the price of crude today. Venezuelan crude production. Venezuela is defying economic gravity, and it's crude production remains unclear how far it will fall in the near term. The U.S. tight oil, much is written and talked about U.S. tight oil, the Permian basins and shale oils, but actually the infrastructure is bottlenecked up. Constraints particularly in the area of pipelines. So new pipeline infrastructure will be built at some point, and then it will come online with higher rates of production. And with growing concerns about the risks to supply and the recent Vienna Group agreements of OPEC to allow members to increase production to meet the group's overall production targets, OPEC's spare capacity also seems to be a concern for the industry. So I think in very quick conclusion, my conclusions, to be brief, would be the world needs all forms of energy going forward. It needs to do it with less emissions, but it's going to take a huge amount of investment every year to keep up. Thank you, Mr.
Grazie.
Thank you very much for this very brief but very, very dense presentation. In the introductory comments, we heard about sanctions, inevitably, and sanctions were mentioned very, very frequently, and of course, this is very relevant to the Russian economy, and not only. And analysts are discussing the effects of this on the energy system in Russia and in Europe as well. What's the effect of sanctions on the energy industry? And in this context, Germany, as we all know, has played an important role, not only because it's an economic giant in Europe, but also because it's close to Russia, and because the energy sector has always been fundamental for Germany. And I would like to ask Michael Harms, who's the Executive Director of the German Committee of Eastern European Economic Relations. I would like to ask Michael Harms to say something, a few words on energy security in Europe.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I was asked by the organizers to give my speech in Russian, but my presentation is in English, so I hope it will be convenient for all of you to follow my short intervention. Уважаемый господин Фалико, уважаемый Игорь Иванович, уважаемые дамы и господа, я очень благодарен за приглашение на этот форум от имени немецкого бизнеса. Это очень важный.
Good morning. Again, I would like to thank the organizers and the sponsors of this important forum. What can we see on this slide? Global challenges. This is a list of global challenges we have today and tomorrow. They are global challenges, but also global chances, global opportunities, which is important to say. We can tackle these challenges only if we start a really fruitful dialogue with Russia in a global framework. The issue of the economy of trust does not just affect bilateral relationships, but also global challenges. And with reference to the cooperation, economic bilateral cooperation between the EU and Russia, well, I might say that for the EU, Russia, as you can see from the slide, is an important trading partner for both imports and exports. From the Russian point of view, the EU is even more important as a trading partner. More than 40% of trade takes place with EU, with the European Union. And our trade, Russia-EU trade, is 10 times higher than the trade between Russia and USA. despite the presence of sanctions and the so-called secondary sanctions. If we talk about Germany, and the chairperson already said that Germany is the giant, in economic giant in Europe. Well, and as regards the German-Russian trade, we can see that these are two very important partners. In 2012, there was a record level. Starting from them, levels have gone down because of recession in Russia and because of sanctions. But this decrease has stopped, as it were, and now there is a new growth. With reference to German foreign direct investment in Russia, here the picture is even more favorable. $20 billion dollars invested. Last year, the German FDI in Russia was about 1.6 billion euros in terms of new projects, and some of them were mentioned. In Russia, we have more, actually almost 5,000 German companies that have created so many jobs. And these are companies that have decided to locate some of their branches in Russia. Here we've got a few examples. The German economy in Russia is not simply represented by large companies, but also by small and medium-sized companies, German SMEs in Russia. And I suppose that this is more or less what happens with Italian companies in Russia. With reference to the energy relationships between Germany and Russia, let me say that in the last 50 years, there was a picture of reliability and stability. Even in the years of Cold War, the relationships with the Soviet Union then and Russia afterwards, well, these relationships have always been very reliable. Russia is the #1 supplier. Igor Sechin mentioned Rosneft, but also Gazprom. Well, these are very active in developing mutual investments that favor energy development. And this is why our energy relations are sustainable and will be sustainable in the future. And I believe that it is important that German companies, especially the Russian ones, become as competitive as possible, not only because they are close to us, not only because of the pipeline sector, but also because of the increase in efficiency within companies, as Mr. Sechin already said with reference to Rosneft. What is the energy mix in Germany? And actually, we have here a slide on the Germany's energy mix with a reference to hydrocarbons first. You can see that hydrocarbons play the lion's share. They are still ranking first, as Mr. Dudley said a few minutes ago. Germany decided to relinquish nuclear energy, but nevertheless, the percentage of nuclear energy is still fairly high. As regards Germany's energy imports, if we consider oil, and Eurasia, well, we can see that Eurasia, Russia is our first partner. So for Germany, it is important to go on and strengthen this type of relationship. This slide is very, very important. Let me take gas as an example. Let me highlight possible development trends in the market of energy supply in Europe in the last 2 years. Let me say first that in the last 10 to 15 years in Europe, we have seen a liberalization of the market in Europe. We have now a more flexible system of pricing system, and we have a real type of competition in the European market, and energy companies compete in Europe freely. In comparison with other continents, in Europe there is much more competition, which means that there are more opportunities for us to import energy from different sources. We've got the northern corridor, the southern one. We've got several LNG pipelines in Germany too. New infrastructures are being built. So we can really choose our suppliers. A lot is being said at a political level about depending on a single supplier, but this is not true. We don't depend on just one supplier. The market is saying clearly that we can choose between different suppliers. We support all projects of hydrocarbons imports in Europe, into Europe, including Nord Stream. And the market is liberalized also in terms of infrastructures, and we can import from east and west as in the past. But now, for example, Ukraine could stop buying gas from Russia, and they could, for example, buy, thanks to free flow gas, they could buy gas from someone else. I think that it's up to the market. It's consumers who must choose. Any sanction will distort the natural market regulation mechanism. With reference to imports from outside the EU, here the situation is similar. You can see that the role of Russia is still important. $1 billion per day is what the EU imports and from outside the EU, which shows how important the energy market is in the European Union. Another important target is reducing emissions. This is a very crucial goal, and if we consider several industries in terms of greenhouse gas reduction, if we consider what happens in 2050, if we go on like this, the goals will not be met. So we have to be careful. In Germany, we talk about Energiewende, which is a radical change, a dramatic change in the energy sector. This is what we need. These are the goals up to 2050, for example, in terms of reduction. But if we consider the projections to 2030, well, they show that these goals won't be met. They will not be achieved. We have decided to exit from nuclear energy by 2022, and by 2025 we will exit from coal as well. So we have to work together, and these are the 4 energy sectors, the main areas for EU-Russia energy cooperation: natural gas and oil, which we have discussed very much. But I would like also, and this might seem odd coming from me, coming from a German. Germany has decided to abandon the nuclear sector, but actually nuclear energy is a sort of going through a sort of rebirth, of renaissance, and we should not, as it were, rule out all opportunities to use this energy. And then there would also a problem of dismantling nuclear power stations. And Russia can teach us a lot here. And also in terms of green energy, this is important. Mr. Siecin, I very much appreciated what you said about your goals, the goals of Rosneft in terms of greenhouse gas emission reduction. My final slide is not focusing on energy only, because I know that this forum will discuss also more strategic economic issues. And these 6 points here are essential for the development of EU-Russia economic cooperation. First of all, we have to create a single, a common economic space from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Let me thank Mr. Nikishin for the activity that the Eurasian Commission is carrying out from this point of view. And some people say that we have to choose between either the EU or Russia. I don't agree. We should not make this mutual exclusive choices. I think that countries must be free to choose, and have economic relationship with both Russia and the EU. We have already talked about energy security. This is important, as the strengthening of the WTO and other multilateral organizations is important. Then there is the issue of connectivity, infrastructure, one belt, one road, and the digital economy and artificial intelligence. I can see Alexander Nikolaevich Shokin. We are working with the Industrial Union. We are working together with reference to the project of digitalization, Russian digitalization project. This should not just be a bilateral relationship between the EU and Russia, but they should involve the whole of European states. Thank you very much.
Questo intervento molto articolato.
Thank you very much indeed for your complex considerations. In the development of the energy sector, the funding of projects plays a dominant role, even though this issue is not often given the attention it deserves. I would now give the floor to Andrei Kostin, the President and CEO of CPD Bank, to share with us his own vision of how funding strategic projects can contribute to the development of the Eurasian space and to the stabilization of the energy market. Thank you very much. Thank you indeed. I have really become a patriot of this sector. There are those who feel that the fact that Russia is rich in oil is an evil. I fully disagree. Having a large amount of oil resources is very important, provided you use it properly and to stimulate the achievement of more favorable conditions. A journalist today asked me about the sanctions and this geopolitical condition. He said, can we still talk about trust between the West and Russia? Well, judging on the basis of my own personal experience and contacts with our Western partners, I think that trust was there, is still there, and will be there, because business is the main engine that groups us together in pursuing the common interest of developing world economy, social progress. In this sense, I think we share the same mind. We don't need sanctions. We don't need to politicize our contacts. We need free business, and we need advanced technologies, especially those in the area of oil. With regard to investments, as Mr. Ivanovic was just saying earlier on, this is a sector that demands a large investment. It's in a state of underinvestment now. If we take into account what Russia is spending to acquire new areas for oil production, well, costs are growing. New fields are in Western Siberia, and of course, exploiting them would be more expensive. That's why we're moving more towards offshore fields. Of course, international cooperation and the involvement of the main world companies is essential also in the framework of these offshore projects. I'm very pleased to see that there are representatives of British Petroleum in this panel, and BP is working very actively with Rosneft. And I think that that is the right way of cooperating to share costs and share profits. My feeling is that now there are a number of things to say concerning investments in Russia. We are often considered to be as the best place to make money, and when oil price goes up, much of that profit is included in the state budget, especially in Russia. Then that money is not largely used, or rather, it's not used as it could be, perhaps. It's mostly money that is set aside in the event that things change. I think that the state has to share this profit, and part of what oil companies earn must be used again in the same sector, so that in addition to crude oil production, there may also be development in the areas of oil derivatives and petrochemical products with a greater added value. And these are the products that can then be exported. In recent years, the various factors that have influenced tax policies have become more complex. I think additional measures are needed to streamline the tax regulations so that much of these funds can be reinvested again in new projects in the same sector. The second question concerns the investments of the financial sector, investment of banks. That's a complex issue because there's a need for long-term investments, and we don't have many chances to invest in the long term. The state is working there in Russia now. A new institution is being built to fund projects on the basis of a development bank. These are large projects with a value of trillion rubles, and predictably through the development bank or other institutions, long-term and low-cost funding can be made available by the country. So that is a good presupposition to start building new infrastructures, as well as new oil and gas processing companies that normally are very expensive and require a large amount of investments in the long term. These investments need to be stimulated also by controlling bodies that tend to view these operations as high-risk operations. Since these investment projects by their own nature, need to be free from taxation in the first years. Indeed, I would say that taxation should be eliminated completely so that they can start off more effectively, as well as to give the chance to other banks and other financial institutions to become more interested in that area. On the whole, I would say that Russian financial institutions are ready to this now. We're working on a number of projects of transformation. Let me also make a couple of comments on the question of sanctions that are now affecting not only the oil sector but also banks. We all know that even though the United States are using these sanctions against dollars, European and Asian banks will not probably give funds to those companies that are hit by these sanctions, that are sanctioned by the U.S. So we are working very carefully. Sometimes other currencies are used, including rubles. Mr. Juncker recently said that the Russian market of energy resources must be mostly based on euros transactions. I know that in the oil sector there's much more that the companies are used to use dollars, but we have to protect our partnership and financial relations from the negative influence of the U.S. sanctions affecting banks, financial institutions, especially those that are related to the oil sector. La Rusal and others are suffering very much when dollar is used as the currency for transactions. I think, however, the investment sector is stable in Russia. Its profits, banking profits, have been rocketing. We lack some new projects, but on the whole, I think that there's a good basis for international cooperation that may give the possibility of making other forms of investments, other sources of investments available. Thank you very much. In the context of free market, free trade, it is, I think, very important indeed to look for new trade routes in all markets, including energy. That's why I would give the floor to Ivan Glasenberg, the CEO of Glencore International, who will illustrate us new possibilities, new possible architectures in the sector of world oil trade.
Thank you. Yeah, the crude oil trading market is slowly evolving, and it is more of a dynamic market, and a new phase of crude oil has evolved, and it is definitely more volatile, it's more dynamic, and it's not as predictable as it was before. The market is really now driven by large-scale, fully integrated participants, and the barriers to market entry is now getting much larger than it has in the past. The biggest market changes have been the departure of investment banks from physical crude oil trading, and you've also seen the start of independent refineries in China starting to be active in the market, what you call the teapot refineries. So, have a distinction between the big oil companies who are moving into trading and are getting into that part of the business, and the trading companies going into the other side and starting to go into refining and upstream activities. So this has been a paradigm shift which has encouraged better transparency in the crude oil market. It's brought more liquidity and has helped in the valuation of the commodity price. On the other hand, it has also created supersized major participants with access to vast and large balance sheets, with the scope to execute larger, bigger deals, and in the case of state-owned companies, it has led to more government-to-government contracts. Thus, the physical market is well driven by very large cap corporations, and the barriers to entry is much harder than it was in the past. What we've also had is a major shift in demand from the west to the east, the growth of regional economies and technological improvements which are happening in the east. The major theme for future shape of the physical oil trading demand is accelerating the dependency of the growth in the east and the emerging economies. Europe, as we heard earlier, for example, has witnessed a huge drive to substitution forms of energy, and this is what's causing less energy to be consumed, and we're moving towards the east, and it is not only because of increased demand in the east, it is the building of complex, large-scale refineries which are coming online in Asia, and this is increasing the demand for crude oil in those areas. Dependence on previous price benchmarks is falling because of the amount of crude moving into those areas, with markets looking for more flow representative price-setting mechanisms whereby they can set the price in those regions, and it is not surprising that the Shanghai Future Exchange is finding popularity despite it's in its early infancy, but we really believe that will continue to grow. Increased market volatility will become a new status quo of a combination of growing speculative trading and geopolitical uncertainty which is existing in the world today. Market price volatility is becoming a popular theme. Flat price is becoming even harder to call correctly as we deviate from established price models into markets which are dominated by algorithms and more speculative trading, which now is focusing mainly not on the traditional sources of media information and more on social media and headlines, which you see in the markets. And this is not only on crude markets where you are seeing this, we're seeing this in all markets, in all metals markets and all commodity markets. People are not looking at the true demand supply, the true fundamentals of the commodity, but speculation, media reports, and different areas there people are taking positions on. Also, as we said earlier, investment banks have left the physical trading market, but they are still active in derivatives. And no, this creates liquidity in the markets. However, it makes flat prices increasingly difficult to get right and accentuates the volatility and the short-term price movements which we are seeing in the market. The global economy has also changed, as we were talking earlier, the center with the oil market, where we have seen full or partial restrictions on the flow of crude oil from its natural arbitrage and economically driven path. This has distorted market fundamentals and has affected price liquidity globally. We may see a chain reaction of protective measures against this restriction. This in turn could cause regions to adopt crude oil trading in local currencies, as we've spoken about earlier, imposing destination restrictions on crude oil imports and exports, and growth of these local benchmark pricing exchanges. So in summary, the future of oil trading will be faced with greater uncertainty and increasing volatility. This will be a function of these geopolitical issues and will cause an evolution in physical market flows due to the geographical displacements of supply and demand. Furthermore, we'll continue to see new technology advances both within the upstream and the downstream part of the business, and larger market share will be occupied by the algorithms and artificial intelligence, which will have an effect on the way that crude oil is priced. Thank you.
Grazie, rimaniamo in tema.
Thank you. Now since we are here in Verona, since Italy is full of many maritime republics that have launched world global trade, Venice, Genoa, etc. I was very much struck recently by an investment in India where Rosneft and Trafigura actually acquired a refinery. And this is the Mayara Energy Limited project. And this is important for us Europeans because it demonstrates how much we can go beyond the let's say, traditional areas in terms of research, development, exploration. So we can really start thinking, we are starting to think in a global way. We have achieved India. This is why I'm asking the CEO of Trafigura, Jeremy Weir, to tell us about new possible opportunities for growth in this field and in other unusual countries.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be back here in Verona and also to be part of the Eurasian Economic Forum. We live in interesting times, in times of rapid change, of great technological advances, and of climate change. We're also experiencing great geopolitical flux. Relationships between countries that have long been stable are all of a sudden rupturing. And new relationships and alliances are consistently emerging. In times like these, big opportunities come with equally big challenges. And this morning, I will talk about the greatest challenge for all of us, discovering future growth. At Trafigura, as one of the largest commodity traders, we take the view there is plenty of growth to be expected. When you look around the globe, demand looks robust, driven by population growth, urbanisation, infrastructure development, and electrification. In the oil market, whichever way we look at it, it's clear that the lion's share of supply to meet this growth in demand will come from a trio of powerful global players: Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the US. This is the economic and political reality of today's global energy market. Let me start by identifying some specific growth points. As a baseline, while we see a world slowly transitioning to a low-carbon economy, the demand for oil is set to continue to rise in the medium term. And demand for natural gas and LNG will, of course, rise even more, both in the medium term and also in the long run. To meet this growing demand, we have seen some dramatic changes on the supply side. The growth in supply of unconventional oil from the shale fields of the US, especially from the Permian Basin, has been the biggest game changer in recent times. For the first decade of this century, the US crude production hovered below 6 million barrels a day. It now consistently exceeds 11 million and looks set to grow even further. Permian production in itself has become world scale. If the Permian were a country, it would be the 5th largest member of OPEC. US crude exports have risen from 0 in 2015 to more than 2 million barrels a day, and should also rise further as infrastructure permits. The big question is how long and at what pace it will continue. Signs of strain are emerging. Witness the significant rise in number of drilled but uncompleted wells. Permian monthly production growth has fallen by 50% just in the last 6 months. Mr. Sechin was right when he said at the St. Petersburg International Forum earlier this year that growth of shale oil production will continue, but it is already obvious that it has limitations both in scope and duration. Turning to LNG, the story is just as exciting. It's obviously moving rapidly from a non-fungible product with rigid long-term contracts between producers and consumers to a freely traded commodity market, including derivatives. Fundamental drivers of growth remain strong. China has doubled imports in just 2 years, and looking ahead, China's import of LNG is expected to increase to 46 million tonnes this year and to 60 million in 2020, and could overtake Japan as the largest importer in 5 years or even shorter. As the International Energy Agency points out, there were just 10 countries importing LNG in 2000, but there are expected to be nearly 50 in 2023. As a whole, The market has grown by over 40% in 5 years, and if anything, that growth is likely to accelerate. Now let me focus on key growth factors on the demand side. India. Demand has grown by 50% in the last 5 years, supported by recently strong GDP growth in an economy performing well under Prime Minister Modi. India is once again the third largest contributor to global demand growth after China and the US. This is occurring in a country where nearly 80% of vehicles on the road today are two-wheelers. Annual car sales in India are still less than 1 million units, a tenth of the level in China or the US. Global auto sales are forecast to almost double by 2030, and India is expected to account for a significant portion of that increase. And that's before factoring in the significant and expected growth in the trucking fleet. This prospect of steeply rising demand is one reason why we decided 2 years ago to invest alongside our partners Rosneft and UCP in acquiring a stake in SR Oil, now renamed Nayara, with its world-class Verona refinery and a large and growing retail distribution network. In conclusion, these and other growth points speak to the big question about future supply. It's commonly acknowledged that the global oil industry has underinvested in new production. We estimate that development projects of $1 trillion were deferred or cancelled during the oil price downturn. More investment in conventional oil and gas is needed to meet rising demand and replace production from exhausted reserves. And that leads straight back to the powerful trio I mentioned at the start of my remarks: Saudi Arabia, Russia and the US. These are the only countries that have the reserves and the investment capacity to generate the order of magnitude of incremental barrels required. The constraints on the US are being hotly debated, and it's not clear how far or fast Saudi Arabia can scale up exports in the next 2 years. So it looks to us that oil from Russia will increasingly be in demand. Russian production costs are among the world's lowest. According to Wood Mackenzie, 80% of Russian oil products will remain cost efficient even if the oil price is as low as $20 a barrel. That's why we are extremely bullish on the Russian oil industry's prospects in the next few years. Production costs that were already low became cheaper still under the current trading regime. Abundant reserves are available and production is mainly conventional. And the recently upgraded infrastructure allows the flexibility to choose between export and domestic markets. Given the current reduction in supplies from some other producers, Russia has shown admirable flexibility and nimbleness of late in increasing supplies as the global market requires. Russia is in the strategic position of being able to bridge the gap by supplying material new volumes to both Europe and Asia to meet future demand. This reminds us of an important reality. In recent years, we have grown used to supply chains that seem smooth and straightforward, but in fact long and complex. I hope that politics will not come in the way of us continuing to develop and refine these supply chains, ensuring that supply from regions that are cost efficient and have plenty of reserves is made available to meet demand. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. And as you saw, and now we have Professor Romano Prodi, who needs no introduction, actually. And we all know him very well for his past career, actually. And Professor Prodi will have a special session devoted to him at the beginning of the afternoon. But I think I could just start by asking him to make a comment on the contributions we've had so far, considering that Professor Romano Prodi knows very well the energy market and the trade and economic relations between Italy and Russia. So he is certainly an authoritative source of knowledge in this field. Thank you very much.
Grazie Presidente per l'introduzione.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chen. I will confine myself to a couple of comments as we heard things about oil, which is not a sector where I'm an expert indeed. I would say I'm ignorant there, but what I would like to do is try to put some of the comments that were made this morning in a more general framework. So we heard a lot of information about oil demand and supply and funding, but it's important to view these things in a specific world condition. Of course, all these things are profoundly influenced by economic trends, and over the past years we saw that the same investments in the energy sectors, investments in the energy sector are highly sensitive to demand and prices, so they are very variable. Now, in accordance with recent forecasts of the IMF, which are not so different from those of the past, it seems that there wouldn't be major variations. There was a slight drop in world development, which is still around 3.6, 3.7. Growth is a bit higher in developing countries than in industrialized countries, quite logically. But as I said, these forecasts seem to be quite self-evident. And yet, there are a number of open questions, a number of question marks, if you like, that make these forecasts a bit less credible, if I can use this word. The first question mark, the first issue is that among industrialized countries, as we just heard right now, China and then USA and India are dragging ahead world development. So in industrialized countries, the US is ranking first. But this development has been profoundly influenced by taxation policy in recent months. And this has placed a major burden on the shoulders of businesses. But this has nonetheless had a major impact on public debt. So the changes of, even interest rates have slightly increased vis-a-vis the past. But will this American boom continue? Well, probably there won't be an economic crisis in the US, but there's very probably going to be a kind of imbalance in the US public in the US budget that will surely have some impact in the medium term, not probably during the electoral period, the election time, but shortly after. And then there's another question mark, as we heard, that concerns oil price. The increased demand that has been mentioned several times, an area where Russia has played an important role, is also accompanied by supply drops during the periods of political crisis in Iran, Venezuela, Libya. And then again, there's another question mark, another political issue that concerns international trade. Indeed, I should have mentioned international trade first, and this is what the IMF has done. I'm referring to tension between the US, Mexico, and Canada that has, in the end, led to a solution, a kind of common sense-based solution, but growing attention is now being given to China. And these are the two main world blocks, if you like. And even the IMF suggests that a small drop in GDP, which we experienced in the past weeks or so, is actually due to this greater amount of troubles in international trade, which is influencing especially the oil trade, because they concern oil-producing countries to a large extent. Now, sanctions, and I would be tempted here to repeat comments that I made last year. Of course, last year we had greater hopes that sanctions would be cut down. Conversely, now it seems this won't be the case. There's apparently an attempt to sort of refine these sanctions. Just to give you an example, Italy exports only mostly instrumental goods. And it's interesting to note that these sanctions are not only influencing bank relations. In other words, they are making exports towards sanctioned countries much more difficult, even though when it does not concern things that have been sanctioned by themselves. However, this area where Italy has been a major exporter is now suffering for the possible sanctions on the software used by the equipment which we export. So that's a kind of, I wouldn't say evolution, but quite the opposite. It's an involution of international economy. So all of this is a clear sign that international trade is changing. We may even end up in a world divided into two large, big blocks. It's really hard to predict what will happen. But going back to many of the comments that were made today, the trade between Russia and the European Union is very significant. A figure of 40% was mentioned. If we think of Eurasia, we might perhaps talk about 36 or 37%. But I would really invite you to focus on one thing. Since 2012, from 2012 to 2017, imports between Russia and Eurasia, Eurasia has been moving its exports. Exports have dropped from 37 to 32%, and imports from China in the same period increased from 15 to 19%. Now they've almost reached 20%. Now, when these major changes occur in such a short period of time, that must really be food for thought. We must ask ourselves what this can suggest. In the Eurasian countries, trade between Italy and the other member countries have always been very significant. De Gaulle talked about Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals. Now, this apparently, for political reasons, is becoming a dream that we cannot achieve. On the other hand, on one hand, Russia is compensated for this by its greater trade with China, but Europe in itself is increasingly isolated politically. Indeed, I would say it's mostly isolated economically. But again, that's the result of this growing political tension. Of course, as an Italian and as foreign president of the European Commission, I find this very concerning, and it's a problem that we should address very carefully indeed. And my feeling is that there's a scarcity of concrete initiatives in this area, and I'm giving this message to all, to our Russian friends and to European friends. Action is needed, and perhaps this has not happened as it should have been. I mean, European economy has been doing rather well for some time, even though it was not growing as much as the United States, but at the same time it has been losing its role in trade. And much of Europe's fortune has always been based on trade. If we think of European Union as a whole, including the UK, we are still the main manufacturing area and the main exporter in the world. But, as I said, there's a tendency to an increasing economic and political isolation, which I find very concerning. It seems to me that there's not anything going on counteracting this drop or loss of relationship with Russia. So what could we do now? Of course, that will be a role of policymakers. The question of sanction were largely criticized last year, and I don't need to repeat that again. But I also believe that there's a need for practical initiatives of rapprochement, if you like. For example, the Eurasian Economic Commission that represents not only Russia but a bloc of countries, an institution that took some sort of inspiration from the European Union, and I think that there's a need to start a dialogue between these two institutions. There's always a chance to open up a dialogue, and that is a way of reducing tensions and to address problems very practically in a very concrete fashion. So you may wonder what I mean by this. Well, at the end of my mandate as president of the Commission in 2005, I had been working and discussing at length with Russia with no U.S. opposition, because that was quite obvious, quite natural there, and we were discussing the construction of a Russian-European Union economic space. So from the Atlantic to the Urals. So that was a very practical and concrete kind of dialogue. We had developed some 13 chapters concerning investments, commercial rules, intellectual property, relations with the banking system, the normal things you need to address whenever you want to build up a closer relationship, or, as is the case now, to reduce existing tensions. I think we should really start from any area. Could be energy, could be something else, but surely we cannot accept any passive attitude. This movement of Russians' interest eastwards is not good for Russia, is not good for us, and it also challenges a very important economic and political balance. In meetings like these, where there are no policymakers, but rather people that touch with their own hand every day how the economy is going, are the places where practical proposals should be put forward. One could say, okay, trade has been partly recovered this year, but the reason was, of course, that it had dropped very much. But I don't think we can really talk about any systemic recovery that we can imagine will continue at length. There are still a number of important questions to address when it comes to imports and exports. For example, give you an example. Last year, Italy's trade increased by 14% versus 2016, but this happened after 3 years of very, very significant drop. That had implied a loss of 36 billion, a loss of trade from 36 billion euro to 20 billion euro. That would really mean wasting important economic relationships. It means breaking a relationship that was benefiting both the Italian and the Russian business. In Russia, too, an important process has started, but that economy has not grown as much as it should be. So we need to start a win-win solution strategy. Otherwise, we're going to see our role worldwide dropping and gradually suffering an erosion. So we cannot be just in the middle of tensions in world economy and world politics. Thank you very much.
Grazie professor Prodi, grazie alla disciplina di tutti gli oratori, siamo leggermente in anticipo.
Thank you very much, Professor Prodi. We are slightly early on our schedule, so we can still use a few minutes. Mr. Dudley only used 5 of the 10 minutes he had available, so after listening to so many ideas this morning, I suppose you can comment, perhaps.
I think we heard over and over about the extreme importance of energy. And we're going to need all forms of energy, and as said over and over and over, that Russia, Saudi Arabia, and America and the U.S. will, to put it in perspective, today 100 million, 99 million barrels a day, there's roughly 11 from Russia, 11 from Saudi Arabia, and 11 from the U.S. So these are the three big blocks. There are countries like Venezuela, which may have the largest oil reserves in the world, but are clearly not capable of developing. I think that was said earlier, I think someone used the word, peacemakers are here. There's something vitally important of the role of business and policymakers talking and keeping the dialogue going. Professor Prodi, Romano Prodi, said dialogue is really important. And I'm a believer, after the Second World War, there was a statement made by a professor, and he said, borders frequented by trade seldom need soldiers. And I think more and more there's a great importance that business plays in bringing the world together, because there's a lot of forces that are driving us all together, apart. So I think these conferences are good. I think they bring people together. You hear a variety of ideas here. But in business, it's very difficult to remain in business a long time by taking direct sides at times of political problems. So I think what Ivan does at Glencore, Trafigura, BP, and the other companies represented here is we try to build those bridges together. And thank you for the opportunity to come and speak today.
Professor Fallico è rimasto sul...
Professor Fallico is still here with us. Maybe he wants to add something, a very rapid comment, perhaps. Would you like to take the floor, Professor Fallico?
Я нахожусь под впечатлением, которое произвел.
I'm very much impressed, I must say, of what Professor Prodi has just said. I fully share his opinion. There are concrete actions that are fundamental from the business and from the political point of view. I would like to thank the organizers of this forum and also thank the participants, Matteo Salvini, Professor Prodi, the mayor of Verona, Professor Antonio Fallico from Banca Intesa Russia, our chairman, Mr. Foa, all the participants, the speakers of this panel, Mr. Dudley, Harms, Mr. Costin, all of you. I thank you very much for your contributions and for the steps that they are taking. Thank you all.
Grazie, Presidente Secin. Il forum è intitolato...
Thank you very much. Of course, we've seen the title, The Economy of Trust. We've had a lot of information about it this morning. We are ready for lunch and we shall resume at 2:30. Thank you.
Si invitano i gentili ospiti ad accomodarsi al buffet al piano terra. Il pranzo durerà fino alle 14:30.
Dear guests, please visit our cafeteria, located on the first floor. Lunch will last until 14:30 p.m.
Уважаемые гости, приглашаем вас посетить буфет на первом этаже. Обед продлится до 14:00.